Hello there, I am Dr. Temitope Alimi, and this is the Our Living Podcast, a show where we learn life lessons from the scriptures, from applying them to marriage, to business, to raising children, having relationships, and everything between. We would learn on this podcast what it means to live a transformed life of one. So welcome aboard. Welcome again to the Our Living Podcast. My name is Dr. Temitope Alimi, and I'm glad you're joining me again this week for this week's episode of the podcast. This is a podcast where we'll learn to live a life of purpose based on the vision of that purpose that is unveiled to us by time. And we do this by learning from the ancient wisdom of the scriptures and applying them to our current realities so that we can get the triumph that the scriptures promised. If you're new here, welcome. And if you've been here with us since season 1, we're glad that you're joining us again in this new episode of the podcast. You can be sure that the Holy Spirit has a lot of great gems waiting for you in today's episode. So please be sure to like, comment, and share this with your friends and loved ones who you know will benefit from this. And like I would always say, Bible says that he who walks with the wise shall be wise, and a companion of fools shall be destroyed. When all the people around you are feeding on the same kind of wisdom that you are feeding on, then you grow together and we become a better community together. So please share this with others you know would benefit from such a knowledge as this. And I also want to say, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's Our Living YouTube channel, and be sure to click on the notification button so that you can get notified every time we drop a new episode, which happens on Tuesdays, right? And if you are somebody who maybe because of your busy schedule you cannot sit down to watch on YouTube, you can always subscribe to our Spotify channel. It's Our Living Podcast on Spotify, and be sure to also follow us on any of our social media handles. On Instagram, on TikTok, and on Threads, it's Ara_living. Okay, so today we have a whole new topic to talk about today. We've been looking at, we started last week looking at the story of creation, and we're in Genesis chapter 1 looking at the things that we can learn from how God went about creating everything that he created, right? So last week we looked at what beginning meant, right? We looked at how God introduced himself and how he made sure that he substantiated his introduction of himself by what he did, right? Please, if you missed that episode, be sure to click on the link that is showing on your screen right now so that you can catch up with us, and so that this week's value would layer on what we spoke about last week. So today we're going to continue that discussion as we learn again from God from Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 to see exactly how God went about doing this and things that we can learn from that. So today we are actually going to be looking at the prerequisites, that are needed for us to begin any project. Again, our text is taken from Genesis chapter 1 verse 1, and we're going to be using the Amplified version. It says, "In the beginning, God, Elohim, created by forming from nothing the heavens and the earth," right? And all of last week we talked about what the beginning meant, God and all that. So, but the scripture tells us that God created the heavens and the earth. But then you wonder, did God just start creating arbitrarily? Right? If there's anything we know about God, it's the fact that he's very meticulous and precise about the things that he does, right? All you need to do is look at the sunset, how beautiful it is, and how precise God is about putting certain things in place. Everything he does is with precision, right? And with meticulousness. So, knowing that about God, then you wonder, did God just wake up and say, I want to create, and then just begin to create like that. That doesn't, to me, that doesn't kind of sound like the God that we know, right? It is evident that he put a lot of thought into the things he created, and he actually thought everything through before he even started creating at all, right? And although this is not expressly, stated in Genesis chapter 1, we can actually see this, play out, right? It's just commonsensical, right? We have this knowledge from God himself, right? He doesn't just do anything arbitrarily. So there must have been some thought, put into what he did before he even began to do them, right? So these are some of the things that we're actually going to be exploring today, right? The prerequisite, the things that we must actually do before we actually start creating, right? So one of the first things you would notice is that before God started creating anything at all, he first had to make a decision about what he was going to create. He must have had to make a decision in the first place that he wanted to create, and then decided on what it was that he wanted to create, right? So remember we mentioned during last week's episode that we don't know how long eternity stretched before God decided that he wanted to create. But at some point in time, God must have made the decision that he wanted to create, and at the end of the day, it was that decision that propelled him to do whatever he decided to do, right? So God must have made the decision at some point that he wanted to create, and that decision, the point at which that decision was made, definitely preceded Genesis chapter 1 verse 1, right? That decision was taken even before we began to see him create anything, right? And it's because every idea and anything that will eventually become something tangible must of necessity begin with a decision, right? Everything begins with a decision. I mean, you cannot create or build anything, whatever it is, whether it's a company or it's a home or it's a relationship, whatever it is, you cannot begin to create it without first making a decision to do so, right? So, and decision making is really not just about deciding that you want to build something. No, it goes beyond that. There are so many questions you have to ask yourself, right? Okay, you have to think, okay, I want to create, right? But what do you want to create? You have to determine or decide what it is you want to create. You have to decide or ask yourself the question, when do you want to create it, or when do you want to build it? How do you want to do it, right? Where are you going to create it? With whom are you going to build it, right? All these are pertinent questions that needs to be asked before one embarks on anything. And I'm sure, I know that these were the same questions that God had to ask himself and answered before he even decided to start creating anything at all, right? So all of these questions are things that one looks at in the decision stage, right? Because without this stage of decision making, no tangible step can actually be taken to actualize anything, because you don't even have an idea of what it is you want to actualize. You don't even have an idea of what it is you want to create, right? So you first must make a decision that you want to create, and then determine what it is you want to create before you start at all, right? So the first step is decision making, right? But you also have to take it from there. It's not enough to just make a decision that you want to create something, right? We saw that with God, that was not just all he did. You could see it was very obvious that God had a plan to execute his decision, right? So it wasn't just that he made a decision, he had a plan on how to execute that decision, right? And we begin to see this play out from verse 1 of Genesis 1. So he didn't just come on the scene and begin to create arbitrarily. No. Having made the decision that he wanted to create, then we see him we see that he obviously had a plan, and he began to diligently put his plan into motion, right? So God knew what he wanted to build. He knew how he was going to do it. He knew for what purpose he was going to do it, right? Remember last week we were saying, when we were looking at Hebrews chapter 11 verse 3, he was telling us that God formed things, right? He decided to create them, and he determined for what purpose they would be for, right? So all of these were things he did at the planning stage, right? He decided how long it would take him, right? He figured out how long it would take him to create each thing, right? He knew exactly what he needed to build or create whatever it was he needed. He knew every material he needed. He knew the manpower he was going to need, right, to build, to create what he was going to create. He knew what it was going to cost him. All these were things that he addressed in the planning stage. And if we are going to create like God, if we are going to build like God, these are things that we also must consider. We must do exactly the same thing as God did, right? So all of these are questions that God asked himself, and he provided answers to before he even began to create anything at all. Before he even spoke a word at all, he had asked himself these questions and he had gotten them answered, right? So answers to these questions, as well as preempting any unforeseen circumstances, all of these are addressed during the planning stage, right? Because it's not just, okay, you decide, okay, this is what I want to create, and you put plans in place to do it. You also have to think of unforeseen circumstances. And in the case of God, right, this is not a factor because God is all-knowing. Nothing catches him by surprise. So he knew everything to consider. But with us, we don't know everything, right? So we also have to think of unforeseen circumstances and be able to put contingency plans in place in case this happens, in case something and that happened, right? And all of this we have to put in place in the planning stage, right? We must think of every possible angle, every possible thing that can happen. But again, we have a limitation, again, because we are human and we don't know every possible thing that can happen. But the beautiful thing is that God knows. And that's why we also have to leverage his help and his expertise, even in the planning stage. While we plan for everything we know could possibly happen, right? We also engage God to help us, because there are things we don't know that might happen down the line, but he knows. And so when we engage him in prayer, and every plan we are putting in place, we are getting him involved every step of the way, he can put in your heart, okay, plan for this, because he knows that something like that might happen down the line. So we get to leverage God's abilities, all-knowing ability, even as we are putting plans in place, right, for whatever it is that we're going to do. So we have to ensure that not only are we thinking of every step of what it is we want to do, we are also making sure that we are putting plans in place so that anything that happens unawares, we are able to at least mitigate them, and they don't disrupt everything that it is that, we are planning to do. So all of these things are things that we must have in place in the planning stage. Okay? So obviously, God made a decision, right? And then he had a plan to execute his decision. So those are some 2 steps we have to put in place before we even do anything at all. Again, remember, we are trying to learn to do things exactly the way God does them, so that we can get the kind of results that God does. Okay? Now, if all I've said so far, you found them valuable and you want to continue hearing more of this, make sure you click the subscribe button so that you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, and also click the notification button so that every time we drop a new episode on Tuesday, you can get notified and can be one of the first set of people, to come sit down and learn at the master's feet. And while I'm even talking about this, you can see this beautiful candle that is seated right here, and this reed diffuser. These are products from our sister company. It's called Ara Household. In Ara Household, we make beautiful home fragrances and home decor, like throw pillows, that help you, set up your surrounding and make sure that it's a beautiful place, creates a beautiful ambience, and so that you are able to, enjoy yourself in your space as well as welcome others. It's a place where you're so happy to welcome guests into, and of course you are stewarding the presence of the king in your space. So please check it out. It's Ara Household, and I'm going to list the website in the link below so that you can check it out as well. Okay, so back to our topic for today. So again, like I said, we've seen that God had to make a decision first, and then he had a plan to execute that decision. But then, going back to our scripture, so the Bible tells us that in that Genesis 1 verse 1, in the beginning God Elohim created by forming from nothing the heavens and the earth. So we see here that what God created were the heavens and the earth, right? He created both the heavens and the earth, and he created them one after the other in that order. So he created the heavens before he created the earth, right? And interestingly, the very first time I studied this was back in January, because this was when God began to pull me towards this particular creation story, right? The first time I studied it, I actually never noticed that the heavens had S at the end, meaning it was plural, not singular. I always thought, and I've read the scripture so many times, right? I always thought it was heaven, right? And the earth. But reading it again recently, I found out no, it's the heavens and the earth, right? So it's multiple heavens that God created, right? Not just one heaven. And this helps me to even understand, because I remember, I think it was Paul that was saying something about the third heaven. I always thought it was just one heaven. But so just even reading this now makes me understand, wait, there are multiple heavens and just one earth, right? So it was interesting to actually see this, right? And so I just wanted to add that as an aside, that wait, there are multiple heavens. It's not just one heaven, right? And another thing I also discovered about this verse 1 was the fact that it stated what God had done, because it said in the beginning God created. Created is a past tense, right? So it only stated what God has said. But when you continue to read from verse 2, you now begin to see a chronicle that details the process that God engaged, telling us exactly what God did with the earth that he had created, right? So it was telling us about the state of the earth, what God did to change it, but we were actually never given the details of exactly how the heavens and the earth were created, right? And you also want to note the fact that although time and space began when God created the heavens and the earth, there was no measure of time at this point. There was no measure of time at this point at all. Because as we will continue in this story, you'll find that the sun, the moon, and the stars, which were the things that God put in place to measure time, they were not created until day 4 of the creation, right? Meanwhile, we're still in verse 1 where it just says God created the heavens and the earth, right? So, as of this time, in what was written in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, there was even no day. There was no day, and there definitely was no measure of time. So this was really profound to me. And so, as he pointed this out to me, I was like, okay, Lord, what does this tell us? What does this teach us, right? What's the importance of this, points that you are pointing out to me? And he said that we also get to choose what we want people to know about us and what we do. Because God created the heavens and the earth, but He never gave us details on how He did it. The details we have from verse 2 are details of how He filled the earth, not how He created it. And so He said, just like Him, we get to decide what we want people to know about us and about what we do. He said, not everything needs to be known. Not everything needs to be known. An air of mystery is always good, right? So we also, like God, must learn to know how to keep some things private. You share what you have to share, and what people don't need to know, they don't know it. You don't share it, right? So we also must learn from God, knowing what to share and what not to share, right? So we then see that by Him creating the heavens and the earth, He definitely was putting His plan into action, right? So this tells us that God did not just stop at deciding and planning what it was He wanted to do, which, decision and planning are often things of the mind, and nobody can read your mind, right? So they're often things that happen in the mind, but because they're in the mind, nobody can read it. It's only when actions are taken that what has been decided and planned in the mind then become evident, right? So we see the first action that God took, right? He took it in verse 1. He created, right? And even as problems presented themselves to Him, He executed His plans undaunted, because He already had solutions waiting, right? He already had solutions waiting because He had thought everything through. He knew everything that could come up, and He already had a solution for it, right? So in other words, a plan that is not put into action is just a pipe dream. And this truly is where many of us are struggling, because we make decisions. We do have plans, but many of us don't put action to our plans. And actions are what substantiates plans. Actions are what make the things that we've thought of, decided about, and planned in our mind, they're the things that make them tangible on the earth, right? So we see God demonstrate this to us. Like I said, there's no way any of us could have known what was in God's mind, right? None of us could have known. The only way we got to know what God had thought and decided and planned was that we began to see Him create in verse 1, right? So until He did that, nobody had any idea of what He had in mind. So His actions substantiated the things He had thought about and the plans He had in place. So this also lets us know that we must do the same. There's no way anybody will know the things you are thinking and planning if you don't put action in place. There are many of us that God has given so many ideas of what to do, but it has not seen the light of day because we are not taking the requisite action that will actually make the ideas that God has given us, to manifest in the earth realm. So it's not just enough for us to make decisions, right? And it's not enough for us to plan. We must put actions in place, because actions are what, makes what we've thought in our mind, the things that have been conceived in our minds, actions are what make them tangible. Okay? So, in summary, we have learned quite a number of things, this today already in this episode. One, we've learned that everything starts with a decision. And just like God, we must decide what we want to build, what we want to create before we even start it out, right? Number two, we also learned that we must go beyond deciding to making plans, right? And when we are making these plans, we must think of every possible thing that could happen, right? And so, again, because of our limitations as humans, we must ensure that we're leveraging the help of God, okay, to ensure that everything we are putting and the plan we are putting in place becomes a reality. So we have to have some questions that we're asking ourselves about what we want to build and all that, what we want to create. And we also must have a clear strategy on exactly how we are going to put that plan into action, how we're going to execute, right? And thirdly, again, we have learned that it's not just enough to decide, it's not enough to plan. We must take actions, because actions are what make the decisions and the plans that we have put in place tangible on the earth. And finally, we also learn that we get to choose, right? We get to choose what we want people to know about us and about what it is that God has asked us to do, right? Like God, we have to learn to know the things that we'll keep private and the things that we'll let other people know, right? So we must choose wisely the things that we share with everybody. I really hope that today's episode has been as eye-opening for you as it has been for me, because we've learned so much from God on how to begin any project and the things that we must put into consideration before we begin or continue with whatever it is that we're doing. Please do not forget to like and share this video with all those you know who would benefit from this. And please ensure that you subscribe to the YouTube channel. It's again Our Living Podcast on YouTube. And like I always say, click on the notification button so that you get notified every time we drop a new episode, so that you are one of the first people to watch it and you can glean from the episode. And again, do not forget to follow us on social media. We are on Instagram, on Threads, and on TikTok at @ara_living. I really hope that this has been beneficial to you, and you will keep joining us every week as we drop these episodes. Until I come your way again next week, stay blessed, stay in the Word.